Hello everybody, and this is a really brilliant place I just need a sip of water. Really brilliant place to give this talk, and I hope some of you have already done this or will do it afterwards, but I've just been upstairs to look at the suffrage display cases in the Museum of London, and actually just the walk into this lecture theatre I've spotted 3 or 4 things, so you'll be able to look at a lot more after I've finished. So, I wanted to thank Gresham. Thanks very much to Gresham College also for inviting me to do this talk because, as you'll notice, I'm currently Director of Literature at the Arts Council, and this gave me the chance to go back to have a look at some of the suffrage material that I'd been working with at the Women's Library, and it is absolutely amazing and an amazing story, and just fills me with admiration for those women campaigners every time. The Women's Library has the largest collection of women's history in this country, and one of the largest in the world too. And the collection came into being because the women who campaigned for the vote wanted a record of their campaign. They felt for too long women had been cut out of history, and there was a chance here to set it to rights and to tell their story. So the collections at the Women's Library, which were cared for many years by London Guildhall University and its predecessor, the City of London Polytechnic, and the collections came to the City of London Polytechnic because the librarian at the time was called Rita Pankhurst, so you can see the connections there. And they hold a wonderful museum collection of the objects used in the campaigns, and I'll be showing you some of those today. And a fantastic collection of photographs which show women speaking and campaigning in the streets. And the brilliant thing about the display upstairs too is you can go and look at some of the films, which I don't have with me, but you will see that too if you go upstairs. So given that the Women's Library is currently closed, because it's just moved to LSE and is getting itself in shape there, this is about the best place to give this talk, because the Museum of London is the other place with an absolutely fantastic collection of suffrage objects and museum pieces. I also want to say that I'm completely indebted to the work of Lisa Tickner for this talk. Her research and subsequent publication, The Spectacle of Women, Imagery of the Suffrage Campaign 1907 to 1914, has really informed the larger part of it. So she's the person to thank, I think. But I'm going to start in the present day. Now, not all of you will know that the 1st of July 2013, soon upon us, is Body Image Day. And it's called Body Image Day because a group of 4 teenage girls from the Joseph Rowntree School in York have invented it as part of their campaign to encourage the local shops not to airbrush the images of women and girls on display to size 0, but to show women as they really are. So these 4 girls, are reacting against advertising which they say influences people more than they think. And they run, in 2013, they run their campaign using social media, a website, a blog, a Facebook page, and Twitter. And it's enabled them to connect, just 4 of them, to connect to local, national, and international press and audiences. So they've got a huge reach for 4 schoolgirls who want to get out an idea that they think is important. They've appeared on Radio 4, in The Times, and they've got followers in the UK, Australia, and Taiwan. So using that kind of media shows you how very quickly, in our times, an idea or a campaign can snowball, and 4 very young women with belief and passion can soon get international recognition of a sort. And I'm not using this example because I believe they've managed to change the face of advertising. I think there's rather a long way to go there. But they have influenced the local stores in York who have been helping them with their campaign. And maybe they've also helped some young women think more positively about their own bodies. And so it illustrates the kind of tools that anybody with a message now has at their fingertips, and how quickly and how widely that message can spread. Now, it was obviously different at the beginning of the 20th century. But how women are perceived and how it's appropriate or acceptable for them to be seen in public was a major factor for the women who were campaigning for the vote in the early 20th century. And many chose to go out on a real limb, crossing all sorts of social boundaries so that they could be heard. And the way that suffrage campaigns used advertising and image was a central part to their campaigning. So, there's no social media available to them, no internet, no virtual social networking, no television, and not really even any radio. So the contrast with the present day would make their task seem extraordinarily daunting to the young women who've gathered a following by voicing their views on the internet in 2013. But there was local and national press, however, as you all know. So what I'm going to talk about today is how women campaigning for their vote got their message over and how they built support for their cause. The 1932 Reform Act extended suffrage considerably to the middle classes, but mainly to the male middle classes, and it was still the case until 1867 that only 1 out of 5 Englishmen were able to vote. But further acts in 1867 and 1884 extended the vote to men, which meant that after that date, most of the debates around suffrage were around sex as a disqualifier, whereas beforehand they'd been around wealth, class, literacy and education. In 1867, John Stuart Mill moved a women's amendment to the Reform Act. It was defeated, but it was the early days of a campaign that was to be active for over the next 50 years or so. And in 1887, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was formed. Now, there we go. So there's Millicent Garray Fawcett, who founded it. So the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies campaigned by bringing the issue to Parliament, and it was debated every year in Parliament, but always defeated, even though after 1880 more than 40% of MPs backed women's suffrage. But that didn't guarantee any kind of success, as the Liberal government at the time, as many of you will know, was not supportive. And as a result of this continuous campaigning, which brought few results home to roost, it became increasingly frustrating for the women who were doing that campaigning, and different points of view about what was best to do next began to spawn in the suffrage movement, and they began to think about other kinds of tactics. So women turned to alternative tactics. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, led by Millicent Fawcett, favoured campaigning constitutionally, but the WSPU, Women's Social and Political Union, led by Mrs. Pankhurst, and here she is, took a much more militant approach, and that's a story most people know about. And it's a massive oversimplification just for the purpose of this talk, to kind of polarise it quite like that, because obviously there were other organisations involved as well. But it's worth noting here that the National Union for Women's Suffrage Societies was the larger and more established part of the union, the movement, and the WSPU was founded in 1903, but was very small at that time. So this talks partly a story of how the WSPU built support, as well as the NUWSS, on a massive scale over the next few years. But before I leave this slide, I just want to, here's Mrs. Pankhurst. I think it's worth just having a look at, you see what she's wearing here. There's a huge contrast between the way that the women who are campaigning for the vote the women who tended to be on that camp as opposed to in the anti-suffrage camp dressed and looked. And Tim was talking earlier about Victorian and Edwardian ladies, and you can see this kind of quite informal, very arts and crafty kind of dress. I wanted to find you a slide that I know is in the Women's Library, but I couldn't because the Women's Library was closed, of Mrs. Pankhurst wearing what looks like a much more military style dress. And we'll come back to that later. But that arts and crafty kind of look is also something that's very influential in how the campaigns begin to look visually. So, in the early 20th century, the Pankhursts and other campaigners targeted wakes fairs in the north, as well as taking on campaigning during elections, supporting candidates who backed male candidates, obviously, who backed female suffrage. It took considerable amount of courage to take to a public platform. There's a huge amount of social etiquette around what it was decent for women to do, and it did not include voicing an opinion or going out alone in public and standing on a soapbox. And I think I love this slide because if you just look at some of those men's faces, I haven't got my glasses on, so you can probably see them better than me, but you can see a mixture of kind of amusement and amazement, and some look quite sympathetic. But there she is, kind of surrounded there. I cannot see a woman in that crowd. So she's surrounded by a sea of men, and she's brave enough to stand up there and make her point. And I've always felt incredible admiration for the 19th century campaigner Josephine Butler, who campaigned for the rights of prostituted women. And she had to use public speaking as her main tool. She went up and down the country on trains, standing on her soapboxes. And as a Victorian middle class and very physically frail woman, she was ill a lot of the time, I just think it must have taken a huge amount of guts to get up there and talk about the unattractive aspects of male sexuality in front of huge groups of very varied kind of men right across the spectrum. And whilst the suffrage campaigners were sometimes met with curiosity, they were also met with animosity. And in his biography, The Pankhursts, Martin Pugh describes WSPU campaigning during the Rutland by-election. So he says, although the appearance of suffragettes in small villages was enough to bring inhabitants running out to see them, they also attracted increasingly hostile treatment from young men. At indoor meetings, youths turned up armed with handbells, cans of dried peas, which they rattled noisily, or boxes of live mice, which they released in the hope of creating panic amongst the ladies present. For open-air meetings, the union hired wagons or lorries as platforms for its speakers. However, in the hands of a gang of youths, these could be pushed around the town squares and village greens and even tipped into ponds, to the consternation of the occupants and the delight of the crowds. And there is a story of, on one occasion, Adele Pankhurst, one of Mrs. Pankhurst's daughters, who was rather a slight woman, was knocked off her soapbox completely. I also found there's an autobiography by the suffragette Evelyn Sharp called Unfinished Adventure, and she describes her early years of campaigning for the suffrage movement as a suffragette in a similar way, and this is how she describes what it's like speaking in front of a group of hostile people. In the years to come, during which I addressed every kind of audience, indoor and outdoor, did I never lose my taste for the platform or overcome that cold feeling in the pit of my stomach, which always proves the true locality of the emotions. I was not afraid of missiles, which varied from live mice to eatables. Chestnuts I used to resent the most, though they may not have been intended symbolically. For at least you knew what your listeners were feeling when they threw things at you, and open warfare is always preferable to the frozen hostility of the drawing room crowd. I love that actually that kind of very English polite hostility can be a lot worse to deal with than people throwing live mice at you. And once on Chorleywood Common, where it was said that rowdies had been hired to break up our meeting, hostility served as a means to political conversation. For by a glorious fluke, I caught, without breaking, a rotten egg that was aimed at my head, and my accidental prowess secured me applause and a hearing that rarely accorded to mere eloquence. This was in the lavish days before 1914, for the unpopular wartime orator was at least spared showers of eggs, herrings, tomatoes, and other scarce and rationed foods. So, obviously, those that were still campaigning during the First World War got less smelly things thrown at them. There are also descriptions of Christabel Pankhurst giving back as good as she got from male hecklers. One drunk heckler was held up by her as an example of what an inequality it was that someone as drunk as him could vote when women could not. Not all speeches were met with mockery and violence. The campaigners also drew admiration, and Evelyn Sharp again describes disrupting a political meeting, going along to disrupt a meeting, which was one of the things the suffrage campaigners did a lot. They heckled themselves. And so they were thrown out of the meeting. And this is what happened when she was thrown out. She said, "We were often met with sympathy from the crowds we addressed afterwards in the marketplace. It was a passer-by, a working man with his tools, who caught me as I came hurtling down the steps from a meeting at Norwich and set me on my feet with the words, 'I admire your pluck, ma'am.'" Leaders of the cause became celebrity speakers and attracted followings of admiring women. Observers at the time noted the different oratory styles of Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst. Emmeline was a small, delicate woman, and Mrs. Pankhurst stuck firmly to her femininity, disapproving of any woman who wore trousers. When her husband campaigned to be an MP, the candidate standing against him was a woman, and this later, and wore trousers, and Mrs. Pankhurst was very, very disapproving of this. And she was sure to present herself always as well-dressed and feminine. Go back and see, she does look very feminine there. Later in the campaigns, the suffragettes did adopt military wear and organisation, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. And one light of the Women's and Social and Political Union, Flora Drummond, was referred to as the General. Suffragettes adopted a uniform, and Mrs. Pankhurst's dress demonstrated military references. The photograph I'm talking about, she has a black dress on with, it's got those sort of, buttons that go across the jacket that you have in a military uniform. But her speaking style was emotive and engaging. In a recorded interview with Brian Harrison, Lady Ricardo recalled that the combination of her expression, the technique of a low, calm voice, voiced a real passion and was a far cry from the hysteria that some people liked to associate with campaigning women. Lady Ricardo said, "Her face shows the character she possesses, the courage and endurance. Her smile illuminates her clever but sad face. She speaks with a great earnestness and simplicity which arrests the attention and keeps one spellbound until she is finished." Christabel, on the other hand, was more of a lawyer. She employed a debating style, the style of a Victorian lay preacher, delivering her sentences in pairs in a very balanced way. She's also known for the power of her speech and her mesmerising performances. Even reporters from hostile newspapers found themselves lost in admiration on occasion. At the Peckham by-election in 1908, the Daily Mail wrote on hearing Christabel, "Shall I speak of her logic? It's inexorable. She has a good case and relies on it. She is saturated with facts, and the hecklers find themselves heckled, twitted, tripped, floored. I think they like it. She does and shows it. She flings herself into the fray and literally pants for the next question to tear to shreds." Being used to boldness from local politics, Sylvia Pankhurst attended an NUWSS meeting in 1905 and found it all very polite and very tame, different indeed from the rousing socialist meetings of the North to which I was accustomed. This statement reflects the frustration at the time, which was to take the campaign on to a different place, a different plane. Speaking on platforms and taking bills through Parliament was not enough. It wasn't working. Oratory needed to be something more. Deeds, not words. Deeds, not words was later, as you'll know, adopted as the WSPU slogan. And as Sylvia Pankhurst put it, the goal was to create an impression on the public throughout the country to set everyone talking about votes for women, to keep the subject in the press, to leave the government no peace from it. The first militant act is usually regarded as in October 1905, when Annie Kenny and Christabel Pankhurst protested at an election meeting in the Free Trade Hall, disrupting the meeting by unfurling a banner. When they were arrested, they refused to pay their fines and they were sent to prison. This soon developed into a pattern of public heckling, disruption and arrest. It was not seen as seemly behaviour by many from inside the suffrage campaigns as well as amongst the anti-suffrage supporters. NUWSS members did not usually approve. In a letter to Mrs. Fawcett, Eva Gore-Booth played the class card and complained, "There's no class in the community who has such good reasons for objecting and does so strongly object to shrieking and throwing yourself on the floor and struggling and kicking as the average working woman whose dignity is very real to them. Our members in all parts of the country are so outraged at the idea of taking part in such proceedings that everywhere for the first time they are shrinking from public demonstrations." So you can see there the kind of tensions that are emerging between these very different kinds of tactics to get the message over and to get attention for the vote. And everyone in the suffrage movement realised that it needed to demonstrate public support. So public support for the vote for women, not just the support of the women who were campaigning, so that its demands should be taken more seriously or taken seriously in the face of a government who seemed determined not to give the women the vote because every time it came up, it was turned down again. And any campaigners know that all politicians are acutely aware of what they perceive the public wants. So, and if they ignore public opinion, they're always on sort of very delicate knife edge about whether they're going to get votes or not. So that's what, Gordon Brown found out when he left his lapel mic on and called the woman who didn't share his opinion on immigration a bigot. So, politicians are all, public pressure is, if you're a campaigner, you need that public pressure beyond your own sympathisers. So given that heckling and militant process had drawn attention but wasn't always seen in a positive light, the campaigners began to think of more ways to demonstrate public support for the movement and to spread it beyond the few active beyond lobbying Parliament and attending political meetings. And the new era didn't just use the power of language that I've spoken about and oratory, employed the visual culture to really spectacular effect. So the next part of my talk looks at the marches, processions and visual culture around the movement, and it provided a spectacular backdrop for the oratory and the way women spoke, but it also put the campaign onto a much larger scale. So post-1905, women artists began to play a role on both sides of the suffrage campaign, the NUWSS and the WSPU. The Artists' Suffrage League was founded in 1907 and worked for the NUWSS, whilst the Suffrage Atelier, led by Sylvia Pankhurst, came to life in 1909. And you can see, if you look at the collections, both these artists' movements have slightly different styles and slightly different ways of doing things. So, and what they did, obviously they were working to produce the wonderfully designed posters and leaflets that called people to meetings and marked points in the campaign. But the Artists Association engaged the skills of artists, costume designers, as well as regular women who weren't necessarily artists. They were all engaged to create a new order of spectacle, really, to get the message over. And these were demonstrated through a series of suffrage processions between 1907 and 1913. And clearly at that time, the women also, you know, photography, the power of photography is really coming into effect too. So it's not just about being on the street at the time, but they're also thinking very carefully about how it's going to look on the front page of the newspaper, what the photographs are going to look like, what the kind of big view of a procession is, as well as what it feels like being in the middle of it and seeing it go past you. And there's already a tradition of trade unions marching, and they had huge, great painted banners. And the Artist Suffrage League's Mary Lowndes embarked on a banner designing project of huge scale. And the Women's Library holds her scrapbook, and you can flick through it and see these extraordinary, very, very beautiful designs for, you know, hundreds and, well, scores and scores of banners. In Edwardian England, most women were skilled at needlework, and so there was already a hidden resource of women who could be called to arms. It was important too that the banners designed would be the right weight and height for women to carry. So they were smaller and embroidered rather than painted. This was cheaper too. The series of marches over these years, both the NUWSS and the SPU-led marches, were carefully choreographed and staged. They were not only a show of determination, but they created an atmosphere of pageant and excitement and were a contributing factor to a massive rise in membership and income enjoyed in particular by the WSPU during that period. The first march was the Mud March in 1907, so called because the 3,000 women who marched from Exeter Hall to Hyde Park arrived with the bottom of their skirts all soaked in mud because it was a very wet day. At that point, the first march, it was a very brave and risky thing to do. Marching in public was not seen as a thing women did at the time, and many of the marchers suffered catcalling and verbal insults along the way. However, it did make a good story. It hit the papers, and the Manchester Guardian was impressed. The Manchester Guardian said, "Nobody can suppose that most of the women who took part can have done so for sport or for the pleasure of the thing. It requires some courage for a woman to step out of her drawing room into the street, to take her place in a mixed throng for a cause probably distasteful to many or most of her acquaintance, and to see herself pilloried in the newspapers next morning by the name as one of the suffragettes. That old ladies and delicate ones and timid ones to boot should have done this quite simply and bravely argues at least a good deal of quiet conviction and a resolution not likely to be easily broken." So the Mud March was careful to demonstrate the commitment to suffrage across all the social classes. Graduates, doctors marched alongside factory women from the industrial north. The suffrage artists were part of the arts and crafts movement, and you can see, as I've said before, you can see it in the clothes they wore. And this comes over in the design, imagery and attention to colour in how the marches were put together, as well as the pre-Raphaelite references in the marches to medieval pageant. So, let's have a look at another slide. Yes, that's just a slide of that shows you some Catholic women in the street. And I remember when I was at the Women's Library the curators there telling me, just not being on that pavement, but actually being in the road had all sorts of connotations that weren't seen as decent by women who were a member of the Catholic Suffrage Society. So they'd really kind of gone out in a limb to be there. So, as I said, 3,000 women marched in 1907. But once the barrier had been broken to undertaking such a daring act, women marching in the streets, the volume and power of the marches grew so substantially over the next few years. The March of 13th of June 1908 included all the suffrage organisations, and it demonstrated the use of their team colours. So the NUWSS had red, white and green, and as you all know, the WSPU had purple, white and green. And you can, our photographs are black and white, but you have to imagine yourself into colour. You see women in those marches adorn. If you go upstairs again, you can see some of the banners and the badges and the colour schemes that women wore. And it was all very carefully put together in banks so that it had the most startling visual effect. Trains were booked from Liverpool, Manchester, Hull, Sheffield, Nottingham, Leicester, Birmingham, Bristol and Leeds to bring women to London. Mrs. Fawcett promised a glorious spectacle enhanced by the gowns of doctors and graduates and nearly 1,000 beautiful banners and bannerets, each different, each wrought in different colour, in gorgeous colour, in rich materials. And the embroidered banners are really, really beautiful. I hope LSE puts them on display again when the collection reopens, but they're very, very rich colours and fantastic designs. So the graduate women who came down on these trains were met off the trains, given lunch, and then they were sent to a robing room as though they were part of a huge degree ceremony, put on their gowns and set off on the march. The procession was 2 miles long, described as a bright river flowing between the banks of a jostling crowd. And there was an international section to the march which demonstrated support from the women from other countries and marked their contribution. The Sunday Times wrote, "There seemed to be thousands of them, every fourth or fifth carrying something in the shape of an ensign. 10,000 to 15,000 women marched to the Albert Hall, bringing inside with them their banners and their colour schemes." And to remind me of the time when I was working at the Women's Library, I went to a Women's Institute AGM in the Albert Hall, which seats about 5,000 people, and it was absolutely full. And I remember looking down from a box and seeing a sea of women in pastel colours, which looked entirely different to your concert audience, which is usually in much darker colours. If you can imagine all the hall filled, there are photographs of the hall filled with the banners and the regalia, and it must have looked quite spectacular. The Daily News remarked, "From floor to topmost corner and furthest angle of the huge galleries, the interior was alive with women, bright with colour." So 150 banners were produced between 1908 and 1913, and many of the ones that have survived are in the Women's Library and the Museum of London collections. And the banners denoted your geographical affiliation, so you can see that these are kind of pretty straightforward banners, actually. They're not some of the most beautiful, but you can see they tell you what bit of the country those women belong to. There were also banners that had professional affiliations. It's just like here. Here's the Civil Service Women's Suffrage Society, and as well as heroines of the past. So if we go back to this slide, you can see here. This is in the Women's Library collection, the Joan of Arc banner, and it's blue and cream. And then Lucy Stone, who is an American campaigner. And those are all very, very rich colours. But so you had women all over the country marching with their geographical affiliations. Heroines of the past, yes, women have done a lot and achieved a lot, and women work, and women are serious people, so you had all their professional affiliations as well. Mary Lowndes who trained as a stained glass maker, saw the banner as having many purposes. Not only did it communicate the simple message, we want the vote, they demonstrated all the allegiances, as I've just said. It was also because of that, that you saw the unity of opinion, all sorts of different kinds of women working from different places across the country, working in different kinds of jobs, with different kinds of educations, all supporting the vote for women. And the banners, as I've said, were also effective because they looked so beautiful and arresting, and they were new and feminine. Mary Lowndes said a banner was not just a placard, but a thing to float in the wind, to flicker in the breeze, to flirt its colours for your pleasure, to half show and half conceal a device you long to unravel. You do not want to read it, you want to worship it. 2 weeks later, there was a second march, this time led by the WSPU, which was to prove even more powerful in its volume and numbers. Pre-publicity was undertaken by cyclists who cycled out with leaflets to reach women outside the main metropolis. Careful attention was given to colour. This time, women wore white dresses and were adorned with purple, white and green, the WSP colours. So it was purple for green for hope, white for purity, and purple for, I've not put the word in and now it's come out, it'll be back in my head by the end. And they were described as a white flowing snake, and it's probable that over 250,000 women attended the march. So we've gone up from 3,000 to 250,000 women in a year, really. 2 years, many standing on platforms and speaking at Hyde Park. The Times was admiring of the courage of these young women who were undaunted and made themselves heard. And at 5 o'clock, an orchestrated, absolutely massive cheer went up on the dot. Votes for women. So the power of these, I'll just show you that's the... There was one of these marches was particularly aimed at celebrating women as professionals, women who had jobs. So this is these are some of the you can see these carefully made banners. They're not banners, but sort of placards or emblems that women carried. You can see them. Where have my pit brow women gone? Yes, you can see them carrying them there in the background, and that's the. I don't think any of these survive, but there's a series of cards like this at the Women's Library, and then here you can see again the women marching, and you can see here they've got their sashes on. These women are probably suffragists. The suffragettes wore the white dresses to huge visual effect. So the power, I've got to speed up, the power of these processions caught commercial eyes. Shop windows in Oxford Street were designed to show their support for women, but commerce was also quick to manufacture white dresses, badges and other paraphernalia. That's in Hyde Park. Badges and other paraphernalia so that women could demonstrate solidarity for the cause. Some items were made and manufactured by the campaigners themselves. Sylvia Pankhurst famously organised the Women's Fair in May 1909, which not only displayed the banners used in marches, but also sold other goods from suffrage books to postcards. In the exhibition upstairs, there's a photograph of the sweets stall in the Women's Trade Fair, and everybody's dressed in white behind it who's serving the sweets. There was a replica prison cell and the first soda fountain. Commercially, statuettes, soap, board games and teapots. So there's an apron that was... and here you've got... This is suffrage soap. So you had your votes for women's soap. So when I said, this is how it gets into everyone's house, though. Not only does this generate income for the people to run the campaigns, but also, it's in your bathroom. You can't get away from the message. And this is Pankhurst, a board game. There also, you can see teapots upstairs, so women serve tea with the campaigning things. So, and people use postcards a lot. We're going to see some anti-suffrage postcards in a minute, but obviously that's like your emails or your letters, and if everyone has got a Votes for Women message on it and it's coming through everyone's letterbox, that's another way of getting the message into everyone's home. Images of Sylvia Pankhurst, there's another, you can see all the banners and the white dresses there. Images of Sylvia Pankhurst, designed for an angel and sower, which I'm just about to show you, appeared everywhere, and the movement used design and spectacle to reinforce uncomfortable political messages. Women released from prison were given certificates and processed through the streets with white horses to attend celebratory dinners. So there's Sylvia's angels. You see them up here. And that became an emblem. And this is a certificate for a woman who'd been in prison. So you were collected from prison, given your certificate, ridden through town with white horses and taken to a dinner. Around this time, the campaign entered another stage, which was to inform the makeup of subsequent marches. Women continued to be arrested and imprisoned for militant protest. In September 1909, Gladstone ordered women on hunger strike to be forcefully fed. This not only spawned a new range of campaigning posters against force feeding and the subsequent Cat and Mouse Act, but it also provided the theme From Prison to Citizenship march in January 1910. The purpose of this march was to demonstrate public support for the cause in the lead up to the election. The Women's Freedom League urged its members to show the public that we are stronger and more energetic than ever before. The eyes of the whole of Great Britain will be on the militants on this occasion, and we must show that militancy has proved a success and has drawn to the cause a great army of women from all ranks of life. So symbolism and emotion were at their heights during this period. And the marches certainly brought in support. Subscriptions to the NUWSS and particularly the WSPU rose substantially at this time, particularly because many upper-class women became supporters. From Prison to Citizenship, so this march here, raised over £73,000, enabling the WSPU to employ a relatively large staff. And this was an extraordinary increase from its early day subscriptions of a few thousand. There were two more major marches, the Coronation Procession, and just on the corridor on the way out you can see a fantastic picture of that if you look to your left, and Emily Wilding Davidson's funeral. The Coronation Procession, 17th of June 1911, combined both sides of the suffrage movement, though Mary Lowndes was a little worried that the Constitutionalists didn't have enough decorations organised. However, Lisa Tickner describes on the day there was Joan of Arc, 700 prisoners, 126 gorgeous, changing, scintillating, iridescent colours of the banners clashing in the sun, and many women dressed in historical costume. The symbolism used in the march constructed a new vision of women, women as leaders, members of society, professionals, and heroines. The marches continued until the last in 1913, which honoured the only martyr to the cause. Although women had gone on hunger strike, none had died, but almost 100 years ago, on the 4th of June 1913, which was referred to at the beginning of my talk, Emily Wilding Davidson went under the King's horse at the Derby. A short film at the time shows her stepping out onto the course to unfurl her WSPU banner, and as the horse gallops towards her, she falls underneath it. The Women's Library has her purse, which contains a coin and her return ticket. Her funeral was mournful and respectful, but arranged in banks of colour. Women accompanied the cortege with lilies commemorating the first martyr. It was the end of the marching season, but the start of more violent militancy. So Flora Drummond, who I referred to earlier, who was called the General, had chained herself to the railings at Downing Street in 1909. I'm sure most of you know that image. Perfect photo opportunity. But the hunger strike and withdrawal of the franchise bill in 1913 took the campaigning to a new level. Deeds, not words, became order of the day for WSPU, which started an arson campaign aimed at property, which spread through the bombing of Lloyd George's house, the laceration of the Rokeby Venus at the National Gallery, and famously digging up the wicket at Lord's Cricket Ground. The violence was not limited to suffragettes, however. Women protesting were persecuted and assaulted by the police. There's a fantastic description of that upstairs. Many described having their breasts mauled and their clothes ripped. It was a far cry from pageantry and show. Posters from this period also depict the violence and horror of force feeding, sending out a hard message at women who were treated, how women were treated who dared to ask for the franchise. So I just wanted at this point to have a look at some of that's Flora Drummond, but seen from an anti-suffragist, in a piece of anti-suffrage propaganda there. But she was quite a big, stocky woman, and so that's clearly modelled on her. But there's a similar industry of posters and postcards coming from the other side, which show women as you can see here, masculine and unfeminine, or make the point that they're not doing what women should be doing, which is looking after their children, or that they're a kind of, again, the child deserted while the women are rushing around up here and everyone else is left, and what women should really be doing is being good wives. And here again, that kind of slight, you see she's in the WSPU colours, but that sort of petulant but also belittling the women and making them seem rather childish, when, as you've heard, everything they did in many ways was anything but childish. But by 1913, the effectiveness of the processions was wearing thin. They'd had a whole series of them, and they're beginning to run out of themes, and the latter ones attracted less public attention as the public had got used to the idea, and also the attention was then directed at the militant acts again. But at this point, the NUWSS came up with the idea of a countrywide spectacle. This time, the women didn't stream into London on trains, leaving their jobs and families, and as you can see from those anti-suffrage postcards, all the kind of adverse criticism that entailed. But the show of protest went out to the people all over the country by means of a nationwide pilgrimage. The pilgrimage allowed for coverage throughout the country, but women could do it in a section, and it got the movement into small villages and rural areas. It was also a demonstration of a different kind of campaigning to violence, and obviously the word pilgrimage is a very pacifist word, isn't it? A very peaceful word. And it also used an appeal once again to the power of language and oratory as the women stopped and spoke to people they encountered along the way, standing on platforms in market squares and in village halls. Thousands of people came to hear them on the way, some friendly, others antagonistic. However, the common cause, the NUWSS paper wrote, but the result was nothing less than a revelation. To those who doubted it, of the almost universal sympathy given to the non-militant suffrage cause once it's understood. However, even though 39,500 friends of women's suffrage had been enrolled along the way, it was still not adequate to persuade Asquith and the government. The culmination of the pilgrimage in Hyde Park was another show of opinion, but sadly it was unable to persuade him. So as most of you know, the arrival of the 1914 war shortly afterwards took attention elsewhere. And the vote was not one for women, and even then not for all women, until after World War I. And it took women's demonstration of their economic value as workers to gain real political power for them. But I think most of you will agree they had employed some absolutely amazing campaigning techniques along the way, and that clearly was very effective in also building up that message over the early part of the first decade of the 20th century. And that's where I'm going to stop.